Hi everyone, my name is Anika Mukherjee, and I am going to be talking today about actionable code ownership, namely around how Pinterest adopted code ownership over 100% of our core API traffic. So a little bit about me. My name is Anika Mukherjee, and I am an SRE at Pinterest, and I am an SRE embedded in our core product org. So I work really closely with our API and web teams. Outside of work, I like boxing, making cocktails, and I have a bit of a passion for cosmology. So why is it important to think about ownership? Ownership is important for a ton of reasons, and I just put three of them here. So first of all, reliability, which we all care about as SREs. So as your feature set grows further and further, it becomes more and more important to identify who the right set of eyes are to triage your problem. By having dedicated ownership for each of these features, you'll be able to reduce time to recovery when there are problems. Secondly, scalability. So as your company grows and as your team grows, the platform team will start undergoing a lot more stress, having to maintain all of the features that use that platform. Having a system for ownership of all of the entities of a platform will help distribute that responsibility and give feature owners a closer relationship with the code that actually is running their features. Then lastly, velocity. So we all know that small compact teams move the fastest. That's why startups grow really fast, and that's why we try to keep teams small and compact. And using ownership to draw these clear jurisdictional lines will help us have the sort of startup culture for each of our features. Ownership is a difficult problem to solve for many reasons, three of them being reorgs, generalists, and tech debts. So obviously, ownership is inherently team-based. It depends on the structure of your company. And if that structure changes, then your ownership model might have to change as well. Generalists can also make ownership difficult because if there's a small set of people who seem to know everything about everything, then it becomes much more difficult to distribute the responsibility of products and of features onto the teams that are actually best suited to own those things. Lastly, tech debt. And this is more incurred if you uh, start an ownership project sort of later in the stage of your company. But this can be really hard if there's a whole bunch of things that no one wants to own and no one knows who should own. So these are things like potentially deprecated features, features that are just legacy and no one really knows how they work. So things like that can also make ownership very difficult. So as you start thinking about an ownership framework for a platform, what are the things that are important to think about? So a lot of this comes down to what problem you're trying to solve. So what is the biggest issue you see that is encouraging you to invest in an ownership framework in the first place? Is it reducing MTTR during incidents? Is it reducing KTLO load on the platform team? What are the things that you would like to distribute among like many feature teams? And so some things to think about is accountability versus initiative. So the way I like to think about this is what do you expect owners to do today versus anticipate for tomorrow? So this might be things like if a feature breaks today, you would want them to fix it, but maybe you don't expect them to do too much to prevent issues in the future, and it's more of a maintenance ownership sort of program. Another thing to think about is common responsibilities. So if a platform team is taking ownership over a lot of the features on the platform, what are the things that they're doing over and over again? And how can we distribute those things onto the teams who are in the best place to do those things with the best efficacy? Lastly, for the actual ownership framework that you choose, it's important to think about, are you trying to have ownership over lines of code or over functionality? And that largely depends on the system, on the platform, and what you're trying to achieve. So at Pinterest, when we were doing ownership, we were doing it for API endpoints, and we have about 2,000 of them. And so we went with functionality. So our goal was not to assign ownership to every single endpoint, but rather to assign ownership to the endpoints that receive traffic in the order of highest criticality. So not every line of code in our API code base is owned. But based on each request, we should be able to assign a best owner to it. So how to actually define ownership at your company, how to write that contract. So like I said earlier, ownership can take many different forms, lines of code, functionality, things like that. So what sort of responsibilities are you trying to distribute? What are those common responsibilities that the platform team is taking on? And then also, what problem are you trying to solve? So at Pinterest, we were trying to answer the question, who is the best person or set of people to answer a question regarding this API endpoint? And this came in play a lot when, in two cases, when there were incidents on sort of an obscure API endpoint and nobody really seemed to have context on it. And then also during code reviews. So if you were modifying some code and you weren't sure how it would affect the product, we weren't sure who the best people to ask were. Something else to think about is that you can't transfer 100% of ownership from platform to feature teams at once. So it's best to start with the biggest rocks to make the system more digestible at first. It can be a very difficult thing to communicate a transfer of ownership from platform onto feature teams because you're basically asking feature teams to do more work. So I have tips on communications at the end, but one super important thing that I found is that it's critical to define a contract between owners and the platform. And this would be an actual document. It can be a living document, but it should have all the same best practices as code. So it should have versioning, it should have reviews, and it should be a conversation between the platform and the people who you're trying to define as owners so that you can have a healthy relationship moving forward between the platform and the owners of entities that are powered using that platform. So what are some of the technical solutions for ownership? So the number one rule that I found was that ownership should be codified and queryable. And this can be implemented in a lot of different ways, but it's really important that ownership is stored in a database of some sort because it solidifies it a bit more and then also makes it a lot easier to implement tooling around. So the solution that we went with at Pinterest was using this owned by decorator. And so the owned by decorator takes in a string representing a project name, and projects are Pinterest's immutable version of structuring our engineering organization. So rather than making our ownership framework team-based, we made it based on projects, which are supposed to be immutable. So even if a team moves top-level orgs, the project should stay the same. And then on import, this owned by decorator does a lot of things under the hood. Most importantly, it registers the endpoint as an owned entity, and it registers the project itself in the registered owner set. Then on commit, when you actually merge your code, we will push these entities to a database, which is then shown on like an internal web application where you can see each project and all the things it owns. So a project can own EC2 instances, workflows, and API endpoints, for example. We have a lot of other tooling implemented as well that we found to be very successful. So we do validation on commit rather than on merge. So every time you push up a new commit, we make sure that if you're adding any new API endpoints or any other ownable entities, you have indeed specified a valid owner. So we do query the database to make sure that that project exists in our database. We have Slack integration, so you can type into Slack something like page this endpoint, and we'll query the database, find out who owns the endpoint, and each project is required to be associated with a PagerDuty account. So then we will page that PagerDuty service. Having all this in a database allows you to do a lot of this stuff. Another thing is auditing PagerDuty settings. So we want to make sure that each project is treating pages with the same level of urgency that we would expect from an owner. So we actually have implemented an audit of PagerDuty settings for all of our owners so that we were really able to identify whether owners had settings that we didn't find acceptable from a reliability perspective. So, how do you actually make ownership actionable? So, a big part of making ownership actionable is empowering owners to feel like they can make changes to their code that best suits their purposes. So, the way we went about this was adding settings onto API endpoints that would allow API owners to sort of customize their settings to best suit their needs for their features. So, for example, our login endpoints are very high criticality, but low QPS compared to a lot of our feeds. So, we created settings to so that endpoint owners could actually specify my endpoint is critical and should be treated as such, but it is low QPS. So maybe we do things like increase the sample rate for metrics for this endpoint. We then created a whole set of self-serve dashboards and metrics so that owners could monitor their entities on their own and with associated runbooks and guides and things like that to really make it a self-serve model rather than a model where they were still dependent on the platform team. In all of this, our goal really was to encourage self-service but make it templated so that owners would sort of take the template and then customize it in their own way to make it work for them. So it didn't feel like we were trying to uh, put a square peg in a round hole. We sort of gave them the tools and then let them run with it. Another thing we found really important was emphasizing the code to feature relationship. So this was actually just a big benefit of ownership was understanding for some of our surfaces, like our critical surfaces, what code actually powers that. And having that understanding has helped us so that when we're triaging incidents and we're looking into bugs, we have a better understanding of how this is actually impacting our users. So I can't stress this last slide enough, and it's about communications. And so one of the most important things about ownership and one of the most difficult things about ownership adoption is the way you communicate it. So most importantly, you need to have an extremely clear message of the expectations for feature teams and a timeline so that they know exactly when to expect when. And then, like I said earlier, this all needs to be documented in a versioned contract. The language that you use when you're marketing ownership as a new project is extremely critical as well. It shouldn't be worded as like a new responsibility. It should be worded as a feature. Like focus on the why we're doing it. And the why for Pinterest was to make Pinterest a more reliable source of inspiration for our pinners. On a more practical level, I found it extremely useful to identify a single engineer point of contact, as well as identify the engineering manager associated with each of our API owners for onboarding. So that way you have a single node of communication who can distribute this knowledge onto everyone, and then also bubble questions up back to you and feedback as well. And then lastly is just having patience. As SREs, we're all pretty well versed in triaging problems and looking into bugs and digging into sort of the depths of the code. And this might be a newer experience for a lot of feature engineers who might not be as well versed in reliability. And so listening to any concerns and addressing them and making things as templated and as easy to adopt as possible is extremely important because ultimately the success of an ownership project is entirely dependent on the relationship that's developed between the platform and the features teams. And if that relationship is impaired, then the ownership project will not be successful. So thank you so much for your time. I hope that this was insightful as to how to adopt an actionable code ownership program at your company. Feel free to reach out at any time at amukherjee@pinterest.com. Enjoy the rest of your conference.